The Meridian Trust and Savings Bank on Colesville Road in Silver Spring, Maryland had the kind of interior that corporate designers call timeless, and everyone else calls stuck. Beige walls that had been repainted so many times the surface had developed a faint texture like old skin. Frosted glass partitions separating the teller stations from the open floor. A waiting area with 4 chairs upholstered in a shade of green that existed nowhere else in nature. On the wall above the teller line hung a framed photograph of downtown Silver Spring taken sometime in the mid-90s, as if the bank had stopped paying attention to the world around a specific point and simply continued operating from memory. It was a Wednesday in early March, and the morning light coming through the front windows was the pale thin kind that belongs to a season not yet committed to warmth. Elwood Gaines walked through the front door at 9:47 in the morning. He was 73 years old. He wore charcoal dress slacks with a crease that could have been pressed that morning or pressed 3 days ago and maintained through sheer discipline. It was impossible to tell which, and that was part of the point. His shirt was a pale blue Oxford, collar buttoned, no tie. Over it he wore a camel-colored cardigan that his daughter had given him 2 Christmases ago and that he wore with the particular frequency reserved for things received from people you love. His shoes were dark brown cap-toes, the kind that take a shine and hold it. He carried no briefcase. Just a plain white envelope, letter-sized, tucked under his left arm. He moved slowly. Not the slowness of frailty, but the slowness of a man who stopped being in a hurry sometime in his 60s and found that very little had suffered for it. He looked at the room when he entered it, took a quiet inventory the way people do when they've spent their lives in spaces where they weren't expected. The branch had 6 employees visible on the floor. 3 tellers behind the counter. A young woman at a standing desk near the entrance who was supposed to greet customers but was looking at her phone. A heavy-set man in a suit near the back whose function was unclear. And at a glass-walled office along the right wall, a man in his mid-30s with his name on a placard outside the door. The placard read, Derek Souza, Senior Accounts Manager. Elwood approached the young woman at the standing desk. She looked up from her phone with the expression of someone interrupted in the middle of something important that was not important. He told her he had an appointment. 9:45, he said, with someone in accounts management. She typed something. Looked at the screen. Said his name back to him as a question, the way people do when they want to confirm without sounding like they're confirming. He said yes. She told him to have a seat and someone would be right with him. He sat in one of the green chairs. Placed the white envelope on his knee. Folded his hands over it and waited. Derek Souza came out of his office 11 minutes later. He was 34 years old. Originally from Bridgeport, Connecticut, 4 years at this branch, 2 years in the senior accounts manager role. He had the particular energy of someone who had moved up faster than his temperament was ready for, a slight impatience in his movements, a tendency to scan a room and sort it quickly into categories that served him and categories that didn't. He was not a cruel man in any deliberate sense. He was the kind of man who had never been required to examine the assumptions behind his first impressions, and so they had accumulated undisturbed. He looked at Elwood Gaines sitting in the green chair. White envelope on his knee. Cardigan. Slow. Something in his face made a quiet decision. He walked over and introduced himself without extending his hand. Said he understood Mr. Gaines was here about an account inquiry. Elwood stood. He was not tall, 5'10" at most, maybe less now that age had made its minor adjustments, but he stood with the full length of himself, which was its own kind of presence. He said yes, he was here to discuss transferring certain assets and consolidating some accounts. He said he'd been a customer of the bank's parent institution for over 30 years, through 2 acquisitions and 3 name changes. Derek nodded in the manner of someone listening at partial capacity. He said they could talk at his desk. Not his office. His desk, which was a workstation in the semi-open area adjacent to the teller line, separated from the public floor by a low partition. The kind of space used for routine consultations. Not the glass office with the door and the chair across from a real desk and the small framed credentials on the wall. Elwood sat down across from Derek's workstation and placed the envelope on the edge of the desk. Derek asked how he could help. Elwood said he was looking to consolidate several investment accounts, liquidate a position in a real estate holding company, and discuss wire transfer logistics for a transaction he was completing the following week. Derek wrote something on a notepad. Asked the approximate value of the accounts he was looking to consolidate. Elwood said they were somewhere in the range of what he'd outlined in the preliminary paperwork he'd submitted through the bank's wealth management portal 2 weeks prior, when he scheduled the appointment. Derek looked at his screen. Scroll. His expression did the small thing that expressions do when a person realizes they did not read something they were supposed to read. He said he didn't have that in front of him right now, but they could work through it together. Elwood was quiet for a moment, then said that was fine. Derek asked for the account numbers. Elwood opened the white envelope and removed a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, the way correspondence used to be folded before correspondence became electronic. He unfolded it and slid it across the desk. On it were 6 account numbers, each with a corresponding institution name and a brief notation of account type. Derek looked at the sheet. His eyes moved across the numbers without registering the notations beside them. He asked if Elwood had identification. Elwood produced a Georgia driver's license and a passport from the breast pocket of his cardigan. Both current. He placed them on the desk without comment. Derek glanced at them and began typing. For a few minutes the only sound was the low ambient noise of the branch. The tellers, a phone ringing somewhere, the ventilation system doing its unremarkable work. Then Derek looked up from the screen and said that for this kind of consolidation, given the account types involved, they would normally assign a dedicated wealth management advisor rather than handling it at the branch level. Elwood said he understood that. He said that was actually the reason he had requested the appointment through the wealth management portal, specifically so that the meeting could be set up at the appropriate level. Derek said the wealth management team typically handled accounts above a certain threshold. Elwood waited. Derek said their standard threshold for dedicated wealth management services was accounts totaling $250,000 or more. Elwood said he was aware of the threshold. Derek's tone shifted slightly. Not dramatically. Just the small shift that happens when a person decides to become a little more efficient with their patients. He said perhaps they should start by verifying the current balances on the accounts listed, just to confirm where things stood, and they could go from there. What he meant, and what Elwood understood with complete clarity, because Elwood had not lived 73 years without developing fluency in this particular dialect, was that he was not convinced this old man in a cardigan with a folded piece of paper had anything in those accounts worth the desk space they were occupying. Elwood said that was fine. He could verify. Derek typed the first account number from the sheet. The number on the screen stopped his fingers. He looked at it. Typed it again because the brain does that when it receives information it wasn't expecting. It requests confirmation from the same source as if the data might change on second inquiry. It did not change. He typed the second account number. His posture changed. Not dramatically. The way a building settles is not dramatic, but it is total. Third account number. He stopped typing. Looked at the screen. Looked at Elwood. Looked at the screen again with the expression of a man who has just realized he is in a conversation that was never what he thought it was. The 6 accounts, combined, held $112 million. Not a clerical rounding. Not an error to be walked back to a more reasonable number. $112 million across 6 accounts, some of them dating back to the early 90s, one of them a trust established in 1988 that had spent 35 years doing quietly what money does when it is managed with patience and attention. Derek Souza sat very still for a moment. He started to say something and stopped. Started again and said that the accounts were, and then stopped again. Elwood was watching him with an expression that was not cruel and was not triumphant. It was the expression of a man who has watched this specific moment happen in different rooms over many decades and has long since stopped finding it surprising, which was its own kind of exhausting thing to carry. He said he had submitted the preliminary paperwork 2 weeks ago through the correct portal. He said he had specifically requested a meeting with a senior wealth management advisor. He said he had been a client of the parent institution since 1991, through its acquisition by Coastal Heritage Group in 2003 and its subsequent merger with Meridian Financial in 2017. He said the relationship manager assigned to his primary trust account was a woman named Patricia Holloway in the Atlanta Wealth Management office, and if Derek needed to verify any of this, Patricia's direct extension was on the third line of the document he had slid across the desk. Derek looked at the document. Patricia Holloway's extension was on the third line. He picked up his desk phone. Put it down. Picked it up again. He called Patricia Holloway's extension. Patricia Holloway had worked in wealth management for 19 years and had managed Elwood Gaines's primary trust for 11 of them. When Derek identified himself and his branch, she asked in a professional but pointed way how she could help. When he began to explain the situation, haltingly, in the way you explain something you are embarrassed to be explaining, she was quiet for a moment that lasted exactly long enough to communicate what words didn't need to. She said she would be on a call with the branch's regional director within the hour. Derek put the phone down. He looked at Elwood. And then something happened in his face that was not performance, not the cultivated professional regret of someone managing optics. It was the look of a person who has arrived, through a route they did not plan to travel, at a true reckoning with themselves. His eyes had gone bright in the way that eyes go before they do something the person would very much prefer they not do in a professional setting. He said he owed Mr. Gaines an apology. He said it in the flat, slightly airless way of someone who knows the words are insufficient but says them anyway because not saying them would be worse. Elwood looked at him for a moment before responding. He said he accepted the apology. He said it the same way he'd said everything else, measured, unhurried, with the full weight of a man who did not need validation from this room to know who he was. He said that the apology, however, was not the thing that needed addressing. What needed addressing was the process. The system that allowed a person to walk into a bank where they had held accounts for 32 years, request a meeting through the proper channels, and still end up sitting in the open-floor consultation area being asked to prove they belong there. He said that politely, without heat, which somehow carried more weight than heat would have. What Elwood Gaines had built over 50 years was not a dramatic story. It was the kind of story that doesn't make itself known until a moment like this one, in a bank on a Wednesday morning in Silver Spring. He had grown up in Savannah, Georgia, the third of 5 children of a postal worker and a seamstress who made alterations out of the back room of the house on East Anderson Street. He had gone to Morehouse College on a partial scholarship and worked nights at a restaurant on Peachtree to cover the rest. He had graduated in 1972 with a degree in accounting, which his mother had thought was practical and his father had thought was a path to something, and they had both been right. He worked for 12 years at a mid-size accounting firm in Atlanta, learned everything the firm knew, and in 1984 left to start his own practice in a 2-room office on Auburn Avenue with a second-hand desk and a filing cabinet that didn't fully close. The practice grew because Elwood was very good at what he did and because he built a reputation in the black business community in Atlanta during a period when that community was building things with the kind of deliberate energy that comes from knowing the structures around you were not designed with you in mind. By 1991 he had 30 employees and a client list that included a regional grocery chain, a construction company for medical practices, and a real estate investment partnership that he had helped structure and in which he had taken a small equity position as partial compensation for his work. That real estate partnership had been the seed of something he had not fully anticipated. The equity positions accumulated. Some failed. More succeeded than failed. He reinvested. He was patient in the way that people who grew up without much are patient. Not passive but steady with a long horizon. By 2001 his personal net worth had crossed 8 figures. He had told almost no one. Not out of shame. Out of a wisdom about the world that had been taught to him by the world itself. That visibility of a certain kind invites a certain kind of friction, and that building in quiet was sometimes more efficient than building in public. He still lived in the same house in Cascade Heights that he had bought in 1989. Still drove a Buick though he was on his 4th one. Still got his hair cut at the same barbershop on Benjamin East Mays Drive where he had been going since his son was in elementary school. His son, Raymond, was now 44 years old and ran the accounting practice. Elwood had stepped back from day-to-day operations in 2015 but remained a senior partner. His daughter, Vivian, was a pediatric surgeon at Grady Memorial. His wife, Lorraine, had died in 2019 after 41 years of marriage, and this was the loss from which everything else was quietly measured. The $112 million was not flash. It was time compounded. The regional director of Meridian Trust's Mid-Atlantic division called the branch within 40 minutes of Derek's call to Patricia Holloway. Her name was Sandra Fitch, and she had the practiced calm of someone whose job involves managing situations that should not have become situations. She spoke first with the branch manager, a man named Glenn Tarpley who had been in a back office the entire time and who, upon being briefed, had the expression of someone watching a slow-motion event they cannot reverse. Sandra Fitch then asked to speak with Mr. Gaines directly. She apologized. She was specific about the apology, not a general expression of regret but an itemized acknowledgement of what had gone wrong. The failure to review the submitted documentation before the appointment. The assignment of a branch-level accounts manager to a wealth management client. The atmosphere of the interaction as Elwood had described it to her. Elwood listened. Said he appreciated the specificity. Said what he needed was not further apology but action, and that he would be following up in writing with the bank's compliance office. He said he would also be speaking with his attorney. Sandra Fitch said she understood completely. Glenn Tarpley appeared in the open area during the call, hovering in the way that managers hover when they are present but have nothing useful to contribute. Derek Souza had moved away from his workstation and was standing near the window on the east wall, the one that caught the morning sun, staring at something outside with the expression of a man conducting an internal audit of his own life. The young woman who had told Elwood to have a seat when he arrived was watching from the standing desk with her phone face down for the first time all morning. The tellers had stopped pretending not to notice. Elwood finished the call with Sandra Fitch, folded the sheet of paper back into thirds, replaced it in the white envelope and stood. He told Glenn Tarpley that he would expect a written response from compliance within 2 weeks. Tarpley said absolutely. His voice had the quality of a man who has learned something today that he wishes he had known at the beginning of the day. Elwood walked across the beige carpet toward the front door. He passed the green waiting chairs. Past the photograph of downtown Silver Spring from the mid-90s. Past the frosted glass teller partitions and the pale morning light coming through the front windows. He pushed through the door and stepped outside onto Colesville Road. It was warmer than it had been when he came in. The kind of slight warming that happens when the thin March sun finds a gap in the cloud cover and makes good use of it. He stood for a moment on the sidewalk, adjusting the envelope under his arm. He called his son Raymond. Raymond answered on the second ring. Elwood told him the meeting had gone as expected and that he should loop in the attorney for a follow-up letter to the compliance office. Raymond said he'd heard that tone in his father's voice before and asked if everything was all right. Elwood said yes. Said he was fine. Said he was going to get breakfast. He walked 3 blocks north to a diner called the Silver Griddle that had been there since the 80s and still made biscuits from scratch. He sat at the counter, ordered coffee and eggs and 2 biscuits, and spent 45 minutes eating slowly and reading the Washington Post on his phone. Nobody asked him to verify anything. He left a 20% tip on a $12 meal, the same way he always did, and walked back to where he had parked his Buick. The letter to the compliance office went out the following Monday. It was 4 pages, single-spaced, written by Elwood himself before being reviewed by his attorney. It was precise in the way that the documents of a man who has spent 50 years in accounting are precise. No unnecessary language, every claim supported, every sequence of events in the correct order. The compliance office responded in 11 days within Elwood's stated window. The bank's formal response acknowledged procedural failures in client intake, inadequate preparation by the assigned staff member, and a pattern of inconsistency in how wealth management referrals were made at the branch level. It announced that the branch would undergo a full review of client services protocols and that the employees involved would receive additional training. Derek Souza requested a transfer to the bank's Rockville branch 2 weeks after the incident. The transfer was approved. He spent the better part of the following year being very thorough about reading client files before appointments. He became, by the accounts of his colleagues at the new branch, a more careful person. Whether that carefulness extended beyond professional behavior into something more interior was a question only he could answer, and he was still working on it. Patricia Holloway flew in from Atlanta and met with Elwood in person at the Meridian Wealth Management office in Bethesda the following month. They had lunch after the meeting at a restaurant she knew near the office. She ordered the salmon. He ordered a club sandwich. They talked about the accounts, about the trust structure, about his late wife Lorraine, who had always been the one who pushed him toward the more aggressive investments and who had been right more often than she had been wrong. Patricia had met Lorraine twice years ago, and said she was the sharpest person in any room she entered. Elwood said that was true and that she knew it and that it had never made her less gracious. Raymond took over the primary relationship management going forward. He was 44 and had been watching his father navigate rooms like the one at Meridian Trust his entire life. He had learned things from watching that he couldn't have been taught any other way, about composure, about the strategic patience of being underestimated, about the difference between anger and clarity, which were not the same thing and were not equally useful. Elwood went back to Atlanta and resumed his life. He got his hair cut on a Saturday morning in April at the same barbershop on Benjamin East Mays Drive. The barber, a man named Curtis who had been cutting Elwood's hair for 22 years, asked how things were going. Elwood said pretty well. Said he'd had an interesting month. Curtis asked what kind of interesting, and Elwood said the kind that becomes a good story eventually. Curtis laughed and said those were the best kind. Elwood agreed. The house in Cascade Heights was quiet in April. The dogwood in the front yard had come into bloom, the way it came into bloom every spring, indifferent to everything that had happened and had not happened in the year before. Elwood sat on the front porch on a Sunday afternoon with a cup of coffee and watched the neighborhood do what neighborhoods do. A couple walking a terrier on the sidewalk, a kid on a bicycle, someone mowing a lawn 2 houses down, the ordinary motion of a Sunday in a place where people live their lives. He thought about Lorraine. He thought about the office on Auburn Avenue with the filing cabinet that didn't close. He thought about his father, the postal worker from Savannah who had driven 11 hours to Atlanta for Elwood's college graduation and had cried in the car on the way home, which Elwood only knew because his mother told him years later. He thought about the green chair in the bank on Colesville Road, and the folded piece of paper, and the moment when a man who had decided too quickly found himself in the middle of the thing he had decided. He drank his coffee. The dogwood moved slightly in the April wind. Somewhere down the street a lawn mower continued its patient, indifferent work.